So I'm a big fan of science fiction. It's probably my favorite genre of fiction, even though I don't usually like dealing in superlatives. But it has a bit of a problem, I would say, and it's a cultural one. And I'm not talking about the ghetto that speculative fiction is forced to occupy, the dreaded collection of genres where all of the interesting things in fiction actually happens, but which rarely gets the recognition that it actually deserves, in spite of its popularity. It's true that I do find this stupid and ridiculous, especially given the fact that romance novels are considered to be real, actual fiction. Unless, they feature sparkly vampires. Legitimate masterpieces of technological and interpersonal speculation are discarded as simple plebeian trash, because they're labeled speculative fiction. But let's be honest, as speculative fiction has been gaining popularity, it's also been gaining legitimization, primarily through the fact that it now is able to provide its own legitimization. So I'm not really worried about that at all. No, what I'm talking about is this. You ever read a sci-fi book and notice that apparently none of the past couple hundred years of human history that happened produced any cultural items that the main characters might find worth thinking about? They'll reference Shakespeare, John Keats, Louis Armstrong, John Keats, Mozart, John Keats, Milton Friedman, fucking John Keats again, Dan Simmons, he is not that interesting. And this happens in the form where characters centuries and millennia into the future will encounter some kind of situation and go, oh yes, this reminds me of a play written by a man who didn't even know about microbes thousands of years ago. Instead of literally anything that might be more relevant to the current times, might have happened since, or has actually had the proper opportunity to influence me personally. And it's also rarely someone from the current day of the author, because none of that stuff has been legitimized by time yet. It hasn't stood the test of time, as it were, and so you don't want to be holding up the wrong cultural icons of the future. No one in an alien nightclub 1,000 years into the future is listening to Mumford & Sons. And the question is, why? Did culture just sort of stop after the point at which the book was written in our universe? Were there no great writers, philosophers, and musicians after the year 2000? Because let me be clear, it's not like it's unrealistic that we might remember figures from the cultural canon that lived thousands of years in the past. We do, after all, still enjoy Cicero and Socrates and Ptolemy and their various contributions to the intellectual pursuits of humanity. And even people being interested in obscure people historically, I don't find anything wrong with when it comes to realism. People sometimes have very obscure interests, and sometimes some meme will be revived a long time after its initial inception because of the random whims of culture. There's plenty of currently respected authors that didn't gain popularity until long after their death. And especially in the age of the internet and information freedom and everything is stored somewhere in some capacity, it's not unlikely that maybe some author from 1750s Louisiana that at this point pretty much no one has heard of will in 20 years explode in popularity for some reason. But still, how did thousands of years pass and nothing else happen? Because if there is something, it's usually very central to the plot, not the kind of throwaway cultural reference that authors put in with stuff that exists in the real world already. Like, no one's gonna quote a poem written accidentally on the back of a napkin by a Chinese Argentinian water purification technician living on the moon in the 23rd century. It's always fucking Invictus. The reasons for this are obviously numerous. First and foremost, most writers are fans of dusty old literature. They're people of culture. And the idea of writing what you know will inevitably lead you to insert some of your own interests into your work. So if you, like Dan Simmons, have an obsession with John Keats to such a degree that you put a character in the book thousands of years into the future that is a guy that painted John Keats once, it's because you care. But also, like, people might understand that reference. Like, no one knows who I'm talking about when I'm saying Saeed Johnson Hill, because he wasn't a real person and he didn't write a series of semi-biographical novels about the first Mars colonists that were wildly popular in the 2140s. Of course, if you pull the reference off well, your readers will probably understand that it's an in-universe reference and might even get from context what it's about. It's just that you also run the risk of being called self-indulgent by your editors and critics. But also, it turns out writers are human beings, and so they will hesitate with things like, very often, poetry. Nobody wants to be the guy who writes a shit poem and then just pats himself on the back because the poem changed the world's political outlook on some major issue. Never mind that this doesn't even happen in the real world, it's just entertainers being self-important. And you don't want to be the info dumper who delivers an itemized list of all of the popular musicians currently on Earth 2 Electric Boogaloo, along with a small dissertation about how music evolved from Muddy Waters to whatever the fuck reason people are now unironically playing the theremin. Just kidding, the theremin is cool and I will punch anyone who says otherwise. But you do need to contextualize these things so the reader will understand them. It's difficult to just go Billy Bia music, because what the fuck is that even? If you go, oh, it's like country music, except it also is played with bongos and a Japanese string quartet. First of all, why is the character explaining this in some terms way outside of their context? They know what Billy Bia music is. Which isn't to say that contextualizing that kind of reference is impossible or even particularly difficult, but it's certainly a bit harder than just saying Hank Williams Jr. and calling it a day. But here's the thing. Nobody knows who Hank Williams Jr. is. When people read books, they don't get most of the cultural references. They just pretend like they do to seem smarter than they actually are. And you know this is true because you're a human being. There's just too many items of culture to know even a fraction of them. There's too many things to find interesting. So don't worry about it. Culture is messy and stupid anyway. Especially when it comes to sci-fi, people really insist on hard world building, but you can't really do this for culture. Oh, I'm sorry, were you able to predict 40 years ago that the biggest philosopher of our time would be a fat Slovenian Marxist with the superpower to inhale 2 hot dogs at the same time? Look, it's not like every single novel doesn't do this. There's plenty of good cultural world building in sci-fi. All I'm saying is try being a little more daring with your fiction, even if it feels unrealistic. Because could you imagine showing anime to a courtier from pre-revolution France? They wouldn't understand that. Why would you expect them to? We barely understand what they did at all, and the only reason that we do understand it a little bit is because we were taught about it from childhood, and the fact that it happened in the past makes it somehow more legitimate than something that will happen in the future. It will just make your world feel so much more tangible and alive. We might laugh at the weird future dance, but the people in the weird future don't. Listen, I'm not saying this is an absolute requirement that you need to do in your next novel. I'm just saying that maybe I'm not the only person who might find this pretty interesting. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. That is H.P. Lovecraft's short story collection. Different guy. I'm very different. This is mine. It's hidden because I'm ashamed. And in that spirit, go read something. And see you around, cunts.